Hi everybody. So today we're going to talk about the overview of the VB map. And this is my own overview. It doesn't mean that it's the be-all and end-all overview of it, and you'll get a lot more information and different information by looking at what Mark Sundberg has to say about it in his PowerPoints, your own review of the manual, your own administration and scoring of it. But I want to point out a few things about it that I think are extremely useful for us to talk about. And so the first one is the fact that it has some additional areas of focus. And so it's a bit of an expansion, in my opinion, from the areas that are included on the ABLES-R. And it does include data on typically developing youngsters to guide phases of instruction. I have seen Mark Sundberg do a number of presentations and trainings on this and participated in them. And he did a lot of homework in terms of what typically developing children can do, are likely to do, and don't do. And he realized that there were some things that he had previously thought were appropriate, like young children answering WH questions at age 3 and 4, which they simply can't do consistently. And I thought that that was, first of all, very, very brave of him to admit, and second of all, very true and accurate in terms of the kinds of issues we have with not being sensitive to developmental factors when we use assessment tools. And he amended the skills to be more in line with developmental norms. And that's been a criticism of ABA intervention, and particularly EIBI, early intensive behavioral intervention, that we're completely insensitive to that and that we sometimes teach skills way ahead that really shouldn't be done. And so I think that that's a really important point. And I really love the barriers assessment in particular, and the transition assessment I think is also highly useful. So those are some additional considerations as we start thinking like, okay, why am I learning another one after I just barely got through the ABLES? It has some additional elements that I think have tremendous utility and are a bit different. I particularly like the barriers assessment, as I mentioned. His discussion of some of the things that prevent children from making the maximal progress that they can. Hang on, I'm pulling up my barriers assessment so I can reference it with some more specificity. But you'll see here that he has things like instructional control problems, behavior problems. We all know that those are things that prevent individuals with autism from being able to do what they're capable of doing. We all know that when a child has a defective MAND repertoire and they're not actually asking for what they want or desiring what they've asked for or asking for more than a small range of things, that these are tremendously important behaviorally, and that we're often making assumptions about this person's language skills that are ultimately completely inaccurate. He also talks about defective tact repertoires, defective motor imitation repertoires. Think about what we talked about with the importance of imitation and some of the progressions that we've looked at in that context. He talks about defective echoic repertoires. What are the implications of that? These are some of the things I want you to think about. So someone who's got a defective echoic repertoire, we aren't going to be able to do good prompting for verbal responses, etc. Defective matching to sample is going to have huge consequences for categorical skills and other cognitive skills. Defective listener repertoires, where they're not able to really shift as the speaker shifts or understand more than one way in which something's presented. Defective intraverbals, where the back and forth conversational exchange is not good. Defective play and social skills, obviously hugely problematic, particularly in the context of one of the things he'll talk about in transitions is the least restrictive environment. Where are they going and why? And what are they going to be able to do when they're there? And are we assuming that peers are going to be some kind of major advantage when in fact they may not be? Prompt dependency and long latencies to respond. In some ways, possibly, we add to these problems with our reliance on one-to-one. He makes that point in one of the PowerPoints you'll look at. Scrolling, just like when we accept, do this, and the child does, that's a mistake instructionally. In the same way, when we say, what do you want, or what is this, and they say, a juice, a water, apple. That is scrolling. They finally get to the right answer, but it's not the way we want it to be. It lacks precision and it's sloppy. Defective scanning skills. I often think that that as a component skill is a huge impediment to fluency in particular. But when somebody can't scan well, it's going to affect all kinds of cognitive skills and all kinds of communicative skills. Failure to make conditional discriminations. To what extent can they process language and take in multiple descriptors of a question? Failure to generalize, obviously, endemic to autism. Hyperactivity. Weak or atypical MOs. Do we know what to give them? Do we know whether we can give it to them? Do they want something that's not deliverable? Do they want something hardly ever? These are things that really affect our ability to be successful. Are the response requirements weakening the MO? So once it gets a little too difficult, do they lose interest in doing the task because it's too hard? Self-stimulation, kind of like hyperactivity, difficult to interfere with. Articulation problems, which are going to really mess us up in terms of echoics and broader, more broadly speaking, also in terms of general issues with communication. Obsessive compulsive behavior, reinforcement dependency, failure to make eye contact, sensory defensiveness. And they're scored on a scale of 0 to 4. And some of you might think, if you look at those criteria, I think I'd love to see a study on how good the IOA is between different members of the team, between parents and professionals. Great research studies there. And so are they all direct observation? Are some of them based on global team input, etc.? But it's still a start in terms of how do we operationally define this and distinguish this learner from that learner in these essential areas. And the transition assessment examines a number of different things. It looks at the milestone score itself, so how'd they do across all the areas. It looks at the barrier score, and it looks especially at things like negative behaviors and instructional control, classroom readiness and group skills, social skills and social play, independent academic work, generalization, range of reinforcers they'll accept, rate of skill acquisition. Think about how fast things clip along in typical environments. Their retention of new skills. Are they somebody who still needs a very rich maintenance schedule? Because that's not generally available in most included settings. Natural environment learning, their transfer without training. Are we still teaching them everything? Do we still know where they learned everything that they do? Or is there some generativity there? Is there some generalized learning? And the transition themes give us overall, looking at their functioning and barriers, areas 7 through 12, specific learning patterns, and 13 to 18, self-help, spontaneity, independence. Again, I just hope you appreciate and look at the way I do some of these things. He's really thought through, what are those things? What are those, unspokens? What are those hidden issues that often are the difference between success and failure in those contexts? What do students need to be successful in inclusion? And he says the ability to learn naturalistically, to function independently, behavioral regulation. And a lot of what he's scoring kids on and looking at kids from an empirical database perspective are those issues. We want to look at this in a nuanced and operationally defined way. So we want to identify core deficits, we want to identify holes in those skills, and we want to identify pinpoint areas to be targeted, including in the barriers area, including in transition skills. So in assessment, what would Mark Sundberg say? Do we plug in holes based just on the skills assessment? No. We have to look at how are we going to decide what to do with this learner and why. What are the variables that are essential to their programming and target selection? In other words, as you familiarize yourself with the VB map and with everything Mark Sundberg says about assessment, remember his high value on level of individualization, that we're always contextualizing this learner in this environment and in their next environment. It isn't functional if it isn't focused on those things. And it should also be the lens we look at to look at whether this particular skill is important or not important. we don't ever want to be, because we have these great tools now, we don't want to become cooks using a cookbook. We can't lose the I in IEP. We as behavior analysts have always been better than everybody else at that because of our single case focus. And we have to make sure that just because such great tools are available to us, that it doesn't stop us from looking so intently and so intensely at this individual, at this person, and figuring out why, how, and in what ways we're going to get them to their next environment, their next skill set. And so I would just encourage you to think through all of that as you familiarize yourself with everything that we study this particular week. So I hope you enjoyed that. I enjoyed talking to you as I always do. I'll see you guys online. I hope you're well. All right, take care.